תודה רבה לפרופסור דרור. כפי שמקודם ציינו החברים לפניי, הגברת ג'וית'י קאניס הגיעה עבור הכנס הזה במיוחד מהמטה מג'נבה, יוניסף ג'נבה. I'm honored to welcome Ms. Jyoti Kanis, Advocacy and Policy Specialist from UNICEF headquarters in Geneva. Please.
Good evening. First of all, I apologize that I don't speak Hebrew, but I would like to very much thank the organizers for the invitation, and I'd like to take this opportunity to share with you some of the experience and research and I think inspiration from global work to combat violence against children in school settings. First of all, as was mentioned, I'm working for the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, which was established in 1946 and has a presence in almost 200 countries. So we're working also with the Israeli Fund for UNICEF and other national committees in industrialized countries, not only in countries where we have country offices or programs. So in the brief opening remarks for this evening, what I would like to highlight and share are some key findings from a few documents that I hope you might refer to in your future work. The first, of course, I think many of you are familiar with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and its protocols. As was mentioned, it was ratified, the convention, by the Israeli government in 1991, almost 20 years ago. And this is a good tool for our work to transpose on the national level. The second is the UN study on violence against children, and a much more detailed report on violence against children that was issued at the same time, as well as guidance from the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child and recommendations from a relatively new UN Special Representative on Violence. So I just mentioned these documents, I think, which could be shared afterwards, and I'll draw from them for my comments. Just to start with the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's the most widely ratified treaty, and it covers a wide range of children's rights. It created the framework for the study on violence because it emphasizes children's rights to physical integrity, and it also obliges governments to protect children from all forms of physical or mental violence. That would include sexual exploitation, armed conflict, abduction, and other forms of degrading treatment. The Convention also obliges states to put in place prevention measures. So I think it's also important to take a moment to reflect that when a government signs a treaty, it takes on several obligations. One is to prevent violations of rights, also to respect the rights itself, and of course to work to fulfill these rights. And in the case of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the obligation is to fulfill all of these rights for all children. So that's a very broad and important framework. It's also complemented by two optional protocols, which have also both been ratified by the Israeli government. One is a protocol on the sale of children, child prostitution and pornography, and the second is a protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. The obligations that governments take on under the Convention and Protocol are reviewed on a regular basis before the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child, an independent body of experts. And the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child monitors the implementation of the committee, the convention by governments, and also provides concluding observations and recommendations. So, for example, the Israeli government was recently before the UN and reviewed on its implementation of the optional protocol on the involvement of children in armed conflict. So this provides guidance to governments and recommendations for improvement. And the committee and its recommendations were really the starting point for the work that led to the process for the UN study on violence against children. The committee is regularly addressing violence in its reporting, but it also made a recommendation to governments and the UN General Assembly in 2001 that they look at this issue more closely, and the governments agreed, and they made a resolution which asked the UN Secretary General to carry out an in-depth global study around the world looking at violence against children. So this, unfortunately, is an issue that's relevant in every country and something which governments took seriously. And they asked the Secretary General not only to look around the world at the different kinds of violence, but also to present recommendations to states for action to address this. And in 2006, an independent expert was appointed, and a process began, which was a consultation to look and research around the world what was happening, and also to consult, I think most importantly, directly with children and youth. What were their experiences? How were they affected by violence? The study examines violence against children in 5 settings. First, in the home and the family. Second, in schools and other educational settings, the topic we look at this evening. Third, in care and justice institutions, also in the workplace, and finally in the community, so children who are perhaps out of home and living on the streets. Just to briefly focus on some of the findings from this process, which took a couple years, the report highlighted different forms of violence in schools, which unfortunately comes as no surprise. There was, of course, a recognition of peer-to-peer violence and bullying, but also violence from teacher to student, corporal punishment. It recognized that violence is both physical and psychological, and that some forms of violence are gender-based, that girls are targeted with sexual harassment, and it also highlighted new trends, such as children bringing weapons to school or using weapons in school, and using technology to bully other students or to exchange abusive or violent images and messages. So I think we know that children have a right to be protected from violence, and we know that this report gives us also other arguments for addressing violence, because in addition to showing the kinds of violence, it went in depth into the impact of violence on children. And this impact is, of course, towards the individual, but I think we're all here and we care about this topic because it's not only about children, but it's also about society and communities. And it outlined a variety of impacts, the way that violence impacts on children and their well-being. First, it went, of course, into the health impacts. That if you are physically attacked, clearly you may have a physical disability or a result of a physical attack, but also it went into looking at psychological distress, depression, and other manifestations. It looked, in addition to health, at children's social development, that if they were victims of bullying or violence, that this blocked the development of their social skills, and that has long-term impact and consequences as well. And finally, of course, it looked at the impact on violence on educational development and achievement, that there was higher absenteeism, that children were dropping out, and there was a lack of motivation and low performance. So I think there are a lot of findings in the report which are very important and which we should also try to look at all the aspects of the problem, because I know some are focusing on health, some are focusing on education, but looking for solutions, we should keep in mind and be aware of different signs that might alert us that there is violence in a school or against a child. So, to come to my final point, if we know children have rights and if we recognize the impact of violence, what can we do to prevent and respond to violence? And here I would also like to bring a tool from the Committee on the Rights of the Child. in looking at the implementation of the convention, they outline what they call general measures of implementation, so that we have a large set of rights in the convention, but one article of the convention, Article 4, says that governments should take measures to implement the convention. And this is very general. So in debates with governments, when they reviewed reports, there was discussion, what does this really mean? So the committee went a step further to issue a general comment, which is their authoritative guidance. This is how we want state parties to interpret the convention. And there's a lengthy general comment on these general measures. And the general measures, therefore, refer to measures that don't concern a specific right, but are rather the foundation for efforts to protect all rights and principles set forth in the convention. And I think in order to be most effective, we should also note that these measures and our actions should address both the policy level from the top down and the practice level from the ground up. And I think, again, the different participants and practitioners, students and parents in the audience, we all have a role to play at these different levels. So I think this is also a reminder when we look at these proposals. So to look to some concrete proposals and frameworks from the international experts, following the UN study on violence against children, there was a specific mandate created for a UN representative to the Secretary General who has a role to address violence against children, Marta Santos Pais. And this year, she just recently submitted her first annual report to the UN General Assembly, and she focused on several general measures as priorities, as recommendations to governments who gave her this task to work with her in addressing and preventing violence. The first, also in line with the general measures from the committee, is to have more consolidated data and research to inform prevention and responses. And I think here in Israel, as the survey shows, you have some consultations directly with children and teachers, but you also have other regular sources of data. So this is a start, I think, to look at what is the problem and how do we want to address it. Are trends changing? And this is an important aspect, to have research and data. A second point that she emphasized was legislative reform. She called for ratification of the optional protocols to the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which the Israeli government has already ratified. And she also called for an adoption of a legal ban on all forms of violence against children. So again, looking at all of the settings where violence could take place, whether in the school, whether in the home, or in the workplace or other areas. And her final point was to call for the development of a comprehensive national strategy to prevent and respond to violence against children. And I think that was a tricky point, because of course under a national strategy you can fold in many additional points. And it's really another framework for bringing in other general measures. This would include, for example, a coordinating structure with a clear accountability and leadership, adequate allocation of resources, so to have a clear budget for children's rights and work to address violence, efforts as well to raise awareness of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, children's rights, and this ideally should also be done through curricula, through civics classes, through English classes, as I saw in one school we visited. And with that, of course, is necessary training of professionals, cooperation with civil society, and again, meaningful child participation, as we also saw perhaps through student councils and other mechanisms. So I think by using the evidence from research and the guidance that's given from these different experts, in a way it's a good checklist to say, what have we already got in place at the policy level, in legislation, in practice, and what do we want to develop? Where are there gaps? And also to exchange, I think, between schools and communities, what's working well. So in closing, I'd like to add a few specific proposals regarding how Unicef might contribute to following up on this conference, to work with you to prevent and address violence in schools. First, UNICEF has been mapping general measures of implementation in the countries where we have national committees in industrialized countries, and we've discussed plans for next year to have a status report on the fulfillment of the general measures of implementation in Israel for the 20th anniversary of the ratification of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So this, I think, will also generate debate and will give a factual update on what has already been achieved and where are there gaps. I think from the work at the international level, what we also would like to bring in the future and to share are good practice models, both with regards to legislation and policy changes, but especially, I think, connecting practitioners and looking at approaches to child participation and education work. UNICEF has national committees such as the Israeli Fund for UNICEF in 36 industrialized countries, mainly in North America and Europe, also some in Asia, Australia, New Zealand. And this is a very strong network from which experience and materials can be drawn and adapted. In particular, UNICEF national committees with governments and other partners are implementing what we call child-friendly cities and rights-respecting schools. And I think these are models which could be presented in Israel, discussed, explored, and to see whether you already have similar projects or whether it's something that you would like to adapt. So I'll stop for now, and I thank you again for your attention and for your commitment to these issues, and I look forward to future communication and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kanis.